first ever public talk that I gave was for the society. And I was terrified then. I just graduated, I think. And everyone was so lovely. And one of the reasons I love the society is that it provides so many opportunities when you're just starting out, and then we keep coming back. So like a sort of archaeological family. So I'm going to do my best to keep today interesting and live up to that. But yes, I do. I have a number of loves in my life, and one is Sudan, the other is the Maltese Islands. The Maltese Islands, particularly the Neolithic, will always be my biggest love and one that I can't get away from. And one I don't want to get away from, no matter what I do. But Sudan is my other home, so I think I'm very, very lucky to have two homes in this world. So, if I can get rid of this bar so I can move my slides. Bear with me. Here we go. So basically today I'm going to talk a little bit about the late Neolithic and prehistoric pottery studies in the Maltese Islands. Then the big part of my work will be what's called an attribute-based approach, and I'll tell you what that is and what it has shown us. And then I'll talk a little bit about petrography, and I'll tell you what it is. Although this is the point 6 is very much a work in progress, and the full results will be presented at the Island Legacies Conference, so organized by Professor Sherry. And that's very much a conference you shouldn't miss, because there's going to be some, not me, I mean, but there's lots of brilliant papers there. But we'll start to talk a little bit about it today. So when we talk about the Neolithic, we have a habit of talking about the temple period in the Maltese Islands. One of the problems is, of course, in the so-called Zabbut and Imjar phases, we don't have temples. They only appear in the Gigantea phase, and yet we have many links. And I find it more convenient to talk about early, middle, and late Neolithic. Even when I'm sorting pottery and material culture, it kind of helps me sort my mind and look at the different phases. So kind of I'll mostly be focusing on the Gigantean, Saflinian, Tertian, but Imjar phase will make a few appearances today. Why? Why do I do this to myself? Well, because it's wonderful. And the late Neolithic is a key period where discourse tends to be dominated by megaliths. So with the early Neolithic, we tend to talk about I mean, I have plenty to say about that, but I'll save it for another time. But we tend to equate people with pots and migrations, and really we don't think about it. And then when it comes to the temple period, everyone focuses on the big stones and forgets everything else and forgets people. But I remind you, as archaeologists, our job is people. We are here to understand people, and we do this in very different ways, some of them highly technical, some of them are different methods, but ultimately we're here to understand human behavior. And what gets to me about this period is that pottery is used in service of a narrative. And there's a lot of talk that presumes homogeneity, but we know this is not the case. The late Neolithic was an extremely dynamic time. So what about the pottery? This is a fascinating period where we have so much about cosmology and social relations. You know, things I've spoken and written about before. But today I really want us to focus on the pottery. So, how? The most important thing for me is to examine pottery beyond established typologies. It's not that I'm allergic to the establishment, which I am, but I think it's important. And I blame my parents. They're here. They raised me to question things. So here we are. But what I want to do is look at how people decorated pottery. And I want to look at the tools used and how they were used. Is there homogeneity there? My point is, in archaeology, we can never assume. We need to investigate. And what about the raw materials? So the first 3 points I'll talk about at length, and the last point, as I said, is a work in progress. There are a few things to note that we need to keep in mind. The assemblages that I'm going to talk about have a very long history of curation. At present, they're carefully stored and documented at the National Museum of Archaeology, but this has not always been so. There's been loss of parts of the assemblage, something that's historical, not something contemporary. So we need to bear in mind we work with what we have. And we also, you might tell me, how are you going to identify tools? And we do that by examining what the tools produce, the core. So by looking at the decor on pottery, we can arrive at what tools were used and what motor actions, how we used bodies to create these things. Finding actual tools is relatively rare, not unknown, but it's rare. And after this, I hope we can have a discussion from experts who deal with bones and stone tools who might come up with some ideas. And there will be quite a bit of number crunching. I'll just leave it be for now and say what I'm about to say accounts for sample size and all that jazz. So let's think about a piece of pottery. We tend to see the final sherd, yeah, in a museum, in an assemblage, as we're bringing them out of the ground. But if we think of the whole chain of operation of how a pot is made, there's the acquisition of the clay, there's the manipulation of the clay, there's the making of vessels, decorating vessels, firing, and vessel use. And arguably, after vessel use, there's another bit of the story about final deposition and the next part of the biography of a pot and how it winds up in museum collections. So today I'm mostly going to be focusing on decorating vessels, and that is where my project started, and that's where this kind of work has to start. And I'll talk a little bit about the firing and also the acquisition and manipulation of clay, but the main focus will be on the decor. But let's take a little step back and have a little potted history of pottery studies or prehistoric pottery studies in the Maltese Islands. And the phase that we now call prehistory has fairly late recognition in the Maltese Islands, right in the early 20th century. The initial studies were not systematic. So, for example, you will read the work by Despot, who notes the texture of clay, if sherds are well baked, the color of the core, and the presence of slip or decoration. The problem with this work, of course, is that these observations are based on 37 sherds from Ardalam out of what he calls a large quantity. But what's a large quantity? Is it 50? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? And then we have people like Margaret Murray, who was concerned with many different questions of fieldwork. But when she observes that Neolithic pots are generally polished, or there's a considerable amount of coarse pottery, and I'll be talking about what coarse means later on, she at least is basing her observations on the work of Temi Zamit. But again, her concern is not sort of understanding the pottery repertoire as such. I'm going to talk about Thomas Ashby because Cordine is one of the case studies I'll be talking about today. And there's Ashby at Cordine, and his lackadaisical approach is interesting because the way he looked at pottery from Cordine 1 and 2 and 3 is very different. So with Cordine 1 and 2, he talks about small, medium, and large vases. Again, what's small, what's medium, what's large. He gives a broad range of rim thicknesses and surface treatments. There's no consistency in how things are described and no quantities. And then when he talks about Cordine 3, he talks about, whatever they mean, rough-faced wares ornamented by firing, multi-slipware, I don't know what it is, don't ask me. Vases incised before firing. The difficulty with this work is that you can't really go back and try and make sense of it. So the only way to make sense of it is to see what survives of the assemblage and start from them. Temisamate divided pottery into the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and this was based on his Tarshian excavations, which is very helpful. The current typology is the work of David Trump in the 1960s, building on the work of John Evans. Now, this has some good things about it in the sense it's based on stratigraphic context, visual analysis of fabric, and surface treatment, and it's been hugely influential. And as a broad framework, it's fairly solid. So why am I poking the establishment? Well, because it needs to be. And one of its main problems is that it takes an extremely functional approach to technology. So how did we get there? If only I could get rid of this toolbar here. I think would be easier with my slides, by the way. Okay, let's start with John Evans. What Evans tried to do was he tried to link typology to chronological phases. And he based this on visual style and some study of techniques, but he has a very limited approach to techniques. And he used data to correlate in part with the typological development of temples, backed by stratigraphy from test trenches, which, let's face it, was very much necessary. And he created a sequence that he divided period 1 Neolithic 5 phases, period 2 the Bronze Age 3 phases. And I want to remind you that Evans, Trump, and actually other people I'm about to mention were working in what's called the new archaeology or processual archaeology. And people have this impression that processual archaeology is very empirical, very this, that, and the other, but it's not always. It can be if we want it to be, and it's not necessarily the complete and only way of doing things, but I'll show you what I mean. Thank you. So the main issues with Evans, first of all, at the time, the two Scorba phases that we now know of weren't known, so that's fine. But, and especially when you're reading Evans's work, it's quite the headache. He conflated Ardalam and Imjar phases and sherds. So you need to figure out what on earth he's on about. He erroneously dated Imjar before Zabuj. He gives a very broad description of decoration. So sometimes you'll find references to techniques like jabbing, impressions. These identifications are generally erroneous because he doesn't set out to investigate what they are. He just makes these notes. And he has a heavy reliance on handles as a diagnostic feature, which is, again, problematic. You see, there are these schools of thought in pottery. One claims that the identity of a pot is its shape, maybe. And then there's the rest of us who actually think, can we think of the people, the hands that made it, the way people were thinking when they were making things? And also, what was I going to say about Evans? When he is writing about these techniques and things, he just leaves them there and he doesn't quantify anything. So for someone who claims to be from the processual school of thought, we're missing a lot of empiricism in this bit. The reason that this impressed where really gets to me, and my students can attest that they hear about this a lot. There is a whole argument built for the Neolithic in the Mediterranean that when impressed ware appears, farming appears. And this is nonsense. We know that the spread of agriculture was not even. It worked in very different rhythms depending on which part of the Mediterranean we're in. We know that the domestication of plants and animals happens at different times and different paces, and we know that sedentism appears in different forms. In other words, although in the Maltese Islands we have this mythical Neolithic package where we have sedentary farmers with domesticated plants, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the story is much more complex. And so when people say, oh, impressed ware, that means Neolithic farmers, that's a really troublesome statement. And also, a lot of pottery labeled impressed ware is anything but. And again, my students will attest, I actually make them look at pictures and point out the different tools, and then they start to see. They enjoy it, I'm sure. So let's go to David. Now, David, it's very emotional every time I bring up David because, I mean, we all love him here, don't we? And I was talking to a friend recently saying, I wish he was here to see this bit of the project and get his feedback. Now, David substantially revised John Evans's work, and David is a brilliant field archaeologist. He was working on solid stratigraphy from Borchin Nadur, Bahriya, and Scorba excavations. He focused on shape, giving a systematic description of shapes and broad macroscopic observations of fabric. Now, we all make these broad macroscopic observations of fabric, but once you see things in thin section, your perspective will change completely. And this was very helpful. Of course, it's lovely to think about shape, but let's face it, the reality is most of our things are bits of sherds, right? We don't always have profiles. I'll show you the size of my data set and you'll understand in a minute. So what is an attribute-based approach? Well, an attribute is the smallest demonstrable variable and the most sensitive to changes, the tiniest thing you can focus on. It's developed by Albert Spaulding and others. Albert Spaulding was an American solid processual archaeologist, right? This one. These days it exists alongside other methods, and even at the time in America, you had sort of the Spaulding school and the shape school. But Spaulding noted that the co-occurrence of attributes forms a statistically verifiable means of quantifiably analyzing variation across time and space. In other words, once you break something into its constituent parts, into smaller bits, you can get an idea of how many times something appears, where, and in what context, and see how it changes across time and space. Now, Spaulding was unusually fond of statistics. I see them as a necessary evil, just so we know where we are. But it's a very useful method to analyze individual parameters when making decoration and then identify which aspects change and which aspects remain stable. And in African archaeology, this is used a lot, again, especially because many people, us included at Jebel Maya, have assemblages where you don't get many shape profiles. And of course, it's changed a lot since the days of Spaulding. And we won't get into sort of the battles in journals and, how to do statistics with this, that, or the other. But this approach helps us investigate if homogeneity is statistically warranted or a perception. We have as human beings, we have these entrenched perceptions that somehow become truths. But it's our job as archaeologists to investigate these perceptions. And so we identify tools and how they are used, but this is just our starting point. We know technological choices are significant across time and space, but we also know, and Spaulding is probably turning in his grave at this, but we also know that technology is a social endeavor. It's not just things, it's a process. And ultimately, it's about people doing things. And we all know that people don't behave in set, rational, linear ways because we're people, not robots. So let's start with our first case study, and I'm sure these sites are familiar to many of you. The Cordine complex, originally 3 temples forming one site, only Cordine 3 survives in the present. And only a portion of Cordine 3 pottery survives. Now, the Cordine complex would have been smaller than nearby Tarshin, but larger than others. Again, we talk of temples, but temples are not one thing. They're dynamic places where many things and activities happen, and they are also different in their makeup, in the way they look. They have a certain logic and rule to them, but we can't just be distracted by the fact that they're all big megaliths. That would really do a disservice to the really fantastic archaeology we have on the islands. Now, these days, Cordine is kind of buried in traffic but in the Neolithic, it occupied a promontory. And this is something that tallies with the broader context of other temple sites, as demonstrated by the incredible work of Ruben Grima. And it has a spatial link to Saflieni and Tarshin. We tend to talk of the spatial links between Gigantia, Santa Verna, and the Shara Circle, but these configurations exist in other places, and heaven knows about the rest of the temples and temple remains. So my assemblage from here was 1,506 sherds, and those 6 matter when you're nearly done with your work. Now, of these, 226 were too small or fragmentary for analysis, so we move them aside, we exclude them. 495 are either solely rim or rim with a body attached. Of these, 28 are decorated rims. Out of 1,279 body shirts, so including rim with a piece of body, 785 have recognizable decor on the body. So for those of you who don't normally sort of do pottery studies, diagnostic, when I was younger, sort of the diagnostic features of a pot, we were told would be what the rim, the handle, the base. But if you have decor on the body, that's also a diagnostic feature because decor in itself is diagnostic, right? Or at least I will show you that it is. And I recorded a lot of information. So these days, you can't say, oh, there's 30 shirts out of a considerable quantity, right? If I ever wrote that in an essay, I think Professor Bonanno and Dr. Vella would would have got plenty to say about this. He still has plenty to say about that. Um, but basically, for each shirt, this was kind of exercise where you end up recording museum inventory, which is, of great benefit to Heritage Malta. But I recorded the same parameters for each sherd. Consistency is key. If we don't have consistency, we are doomed, right? Consistency and repetition. And then to give you an idea of the kind of things that that you find, you start to break it down. How many decorated rims do you have? What types of tools can we identify? When we look, for example, at the decorated body shirts, we start to find a number of interesting things. Forget the impressed wear nonsense. It's much more interesting than that. So, for example, one of the ones I really love in the assemblage is comb stamped alternative pivoting lines, a really boring term to describe, and I hope I can show this while I'm on camera. So, first of all, combs, right? Think of a hair comb, but many things can be a comb. And you can make a comb out of many different things. And you can vary the teeth of a comb. Do you want them thicker? Do you want them thinner? Do you want them pointed? Do you want them with a round base? You can do anything. Much like you have a comb for sectioning your hair and a comb for your curls and a comb for, combs exist in many forms. So, but the action is, so you take a comb. Oh, let's do this so they can see. Okay. So we take the comb, we stamp it, then pivot, fan, okay, and then stamp again. So we'll show it here again. Comb, pivot, turn, stamp. And you can repeat this action as many times as you want to create, depending what you want to create. When we start to think about these things, we're also seeing the thought process that people have and the way that you plan. You don't start to decorate a pot without having some idea of what you want to do. With this, you're building the tools to do this. So already there is something going on here. So yes, and for example, we have something I really like is we have these deep dots made by seed pods, and we haven't been able to identify the seed pods yet. If there's anyone who's an expert in this, please do come talk to me, and you'll make me very happy. Other techniques, and then you start breaking down which techniques appear in which phase. So the next term that comes up a lot is a stylus. Now, what's a stylus? It can be, for those following on Zoom, like a pen or a stick. Yeah, it can be the stylus used to draw on your tablet. It can be something pointy. The point is you can make a stylus out of anything. You can fashion an animal bone to a point. You can make it out of a piece of wood. And you can do it and you can use it to create different things. Think of pencils. You can get thin clutch pencils, you can get HB pencils, 2B pencils, they all have different thicknesses and they all produce different effects. And so that is what we have saying decoration is scratched or jabbed. We miss a lot when we stop there. Let me show you some examples because I think we should see some of the examples. So then this is the kind of thing I do. Once you spend long enough looking at your assemblage, you can start to identify the tools and motor actions pretty quickly. The Amjar phase in general on temple sites is present but in small quantities, the exception being Skorba where it's present in large quantities because there's a couple of layers of pure Amjar phase. But it's found at a number of temple sites otherwise, so Middle Neolithic. And again, here you can see the different ways. So we have the first one, there's a channel incised by a type of a stylus, creating a type of pattern. Then in the middle one, someone created channels by a type of comb. And in the third one, what may look like impressing is actually lines incised by a stylus or two types of stylus actually there. Ah, there we go. One thing I love to see a lot in the assemblage is we think of tools as something that we make, but our bodies are also tools. Our hands, our fingers, they are also tools. I mean, people who study stone tools are like, duh, we've been saying that for a long time. But I really enjoy finding fingernail jabs, for example, or fingers used to pinch clay to form the rim. It really brings it home how personal, how human pottery is. And you often find combination of things. So, for example, if you look at the one on the right, under the rim, someone used a stylus to incise a channel, and then just visible is a cord wrapped impressed element. All that is that you take a stick or whatever, wrap a cord around it and press it in the clay. And depending on the type of cord you're using, you create different patterns. It's not easy to do this. I sometimes, when I'm teaching, I tend to do this on modeling clay and make my own tools and use my own tools. And there's a technique, sena, kif nejdu bil-Malti, ikollok is-sena, you have to have the handedness, the ability, and the technique to learn how to do these. And so if we look in the Imjar phase at Cordine, over half of the decor is made by a tool other than a stylus. This will change in the later phases. And you can see here the different types, cord wrapped elements, fingernails, grooved channels. So combs are, a comb and a stylus are basically the two most flexible things in your toolkit. When we switch to the Gigantia phase, decor is dominated by stylus tools. And you can have cross-hatching, you can have the typical lines that end in a so-called cherry shapes, you can incise lines in bands and do it with, and put in ochre or other color if you like. So you can do many things. And so if we look again at all the numbers and all the statistics, you can see there's a dominance of stylus tools and there's a dominance of certain themes and certain designs. When we get to the Tarshan phase, these are the seed impressions made by a seed pod. Now, if anyone knows their seeds and would like to offer an idea of what the seeds may be, that please do come talk to me at some point. I'd be really grateful. And in the Tarshan phase in general, not just at Cordine, we find a variety of decor and tools and motor actions. I really love these finger groove channels. And again, you have to know how much pressure to apply to your wet clay. You know, you don't just do it blindly. And sometimes with a stylus, I mean, that's a fancy term, just to say that you jab your stylus and you elongate it into a deep drag line. It's not a jabbing of things. Sometimes you can use a stylus to do really fine line work like that. Again, for each one, you have to know which type of stylus to use and how much pressure to apply. And so if we turn to the Tarshan phase, again, we see there's a lot of stylus used here, but it's not the only technique, but it's the one that's the most popular. If we turn to Hajar Aim and then to Mitre, so now you have an idea of how I go about it. So there'll be a lot less tables and numbers, I promise you. But again, we have Hajar Aim on a hilltop overlooking the sea and the coast. It's had various interventions in its lifetime. Remember, most of our temples have long and complex biographies. Now we see them as they exist now in the present. To the people living in the Neolithic, they were constantly changing. They were constantly doing maintenance. They were adding bits, blocking of bits. They are the buildings, just like today in our churches. Now we interact and we go back and forth and aniranjaw in nicha, and another time we restore the roof. These are buildings that are used all the time. So we have a main building, two smaller outlying areas, and as I said, altered during the late Neolithic in the Tarshian phase. And again here, this is the surviving assemblage that I was able to look at. As with Cordine, the stylus is the dominant decor, but in both phases we find commonalities, but in different quantities. So let's look at some of them, because I want to draw your attention to some of them. So if we start with the left, we have comb dragged lines, and that's a fairly simple thing to do. And then we have, again, playing with our stylus, but this time someone is creating very neat, even lines and filling them with paste. The one I really like is this one. So let's take a closer look, because it's comb stamping. Now, this, and I hope these things look clear when they're right in front of you, by the way, but this is really interesting because it's a very fine comb. Think of the really fine comb you would use to, I don't know, make your fringe stand up or something. You know, those really thin comb. It's something, but think of it. You didn't buy it. You have to make it, is my point with this, right? And then someone is planning how to create that shape and fill it with the comb. And then you have to be really even-handed and really precise in how to do it. See how much more interesting this is than saying impressed where and going home. We can really appreciate the people behind these. And again, in the Tarshian phase, we find a number of other techniques, and I'm going to draw your attention to that pot in particular, because here we see a number of interesting things. You can see, so this is your usual carinated bowl, right? And it's got a knob handle. Now, this, you're not just playing, the thing with this, and even this one, yeah? Oops. Right? We're not just making these designs on a flat piece of pottery. When potters are making this, they have a three-dimensional object. And doing this on a three-dimensional object is not easy. And so we can see here that they're following the shape of the pot, avoiding the handle, trying to create this vision of using the lines, right, to enhance the shape and give more of a visual effect. But also, we can see where sometimes it's not so easy, because if we look, I'm just going to quickly point you to here and here. You can see the lines are not quite as they are. And that's because it's quite a difficult part of the pot to do that, right? But the overall effect is great. And then if we turn to Imnidra, so 500 meters down the road from Hajar Im, again, various interventions. We have the lower and middle temples, which are structurally interdependent, and the detached small temple. As with Hajar Im, we have traces of smaller structures here and there. And God, how I wish I could investigate some of those, because I think that's where we're going to find the really cool stuff. And so again, from here, I had an assemblage of 703 sherds. Again, there are some differences in the decor and in the tools used. So if we look at some examples, there's what you do when you want to incise things lightly with a stylus. Here is where you can use a comb and a stylus together. And then this is another one that I really love, because these arcs, that again is a very fine comb with very fine teeth, spaced fairly precisely in between each other to create that shape. And again, you're doing this on a 3D object, not on a flat piece of clay. And if we go to the Tarshian phase in Imnidra, I have to say, there are two I really love. The middle one with the deep nail jabs, because again, it's someone using, and when you're looking at your 1,700 shirt, it's really nice to come across something like this. But then I like this one, overlapping waves of clay, because I don't know if the Neolithic potters had a patron saint for students still learning how to do it, but I feel like this would be me learning how to do it, not quite getting it right, and yet somehow thought it was good enough to deposit in a temple, in a place that has a lot of significance. And it's so human because it's someone's finger, someone really trying to create something, to create a design with this. And, you know, be for effort, I would say. But I just kind of feel like that would have been me back in the Neolithic. So but if we compare all the sites, what happens, right? What do we see? And actually, we see some differences. In Hajar we have less diversity in rim forms. During the Gigantea phase, we have comparable percentages between all sides, but in the Tarshian phase, we have a lack of thin everted rims when compared to Cordine 3. Thin rims with flattened tops only appear in the Gigantea phase at Hajar but appear in the Gigantea and Tarshian phases at Cordine 3. Now, even allowing for the vagaries of the assemblages, sometimes even if we say go to the Tarshian phase and look at the rims, thick straight rims, 50% of the assemblage at Imnaidra, 11 at Hajar but thick everted rims are less at Imnaidra, more at Imnaidra and less at Hajar From these assemblages, I only found Imjar shards at Cordine 3. Again, that's going to likely be due to what has survived in the assemblage, if we go by the general pattern of what we know in the archaeological record. Saflini shards I only found at Imnaidra. Now, again, Saflini is one of those poor misunderstood phases that some people just very brashly say we should just excise it because it's only found at Saflini. It's not only found at Saflini, as David Trump has shown us, and his stratigraphy is reliable. So Saflini shards are found in a lot of places, but like many transitional phases, like the Zabuch and Imjar, these are things that tend to be overlooked. So I hope I can come across more in assemblages and do further work on this. We can't use the excuse, oh, I don't know I don't know how to identify them, therefore they don't exist. That's not how things work. Now, this long list here, don't worry about it. I just want to use this to highlight something. Because although the tools, sort of the toolkit is combs, fingers, spatula, stylus, the motor actions, the things we do with the tools, the way we use our hands, they vary. So what people are doing, the way they're using their hands, the way they're thinking about things, and the designs they're creating, there is variations between sites. So some motor actions are found at Cordine 3, but not in Nidra. And equally, some are found at Imnaidra, but not Cordine 3. And again, this is not surprising, and I'll come back to this in a little bit. Because I want to focus for my last bit, on the work that's now in progress. Lessons from ceramic petrography. Now, I do the ceramic petrography for our Sudanese material. This particular work was carried out in part by the University of Durham, and these are some of the preliminary results. But just to say, thin section petrography has many uses. Thin section ceramic petrography is the study of a clay object's composition under a polarized light microscope. So you can use it in geology, you can use it to study soil sediments. I'm just going to focus on the pottery. And we look at the mineralogical composition of pottery. And this is what we call destructive analysis because it involves cutting a sherd, processing it in a certain way to create the glass slides that you see there. Now, to get to this point, look, it took me a couple of years to get through the assemblage and the statistics to begin with, right, to see what it is. So that's the biggest chunk of work. This is a whole other process, not just in getting export permits and things arranged, but in doing the actual work. So this work takes time, is what I mean. Now, a polarizing light microscope uses two types of light, plain polarized light and cross polars. PPL is similar to regular transmitted light, and cross polars, XP, is polarized in two directions and interacts with the mineral specimens in the thin section. And then the optical effect is used to identify minerals. I'll show you some examples. Just resign yourself to hours looking down a microscope. But I want to remind you of what Patrick Quinn is like the god of petrography. And he reminds us that archaeological ceramics are artifacts made by human hands and thus bear evidence of the technologies involved in their manufacture. In other words, we don't just do all this dilkedda just to identify minerals, but we are doing all this work to try and understand something about human behavior. So an overview is we looked at 122 samples from key sites, including Hajar Ibn Naidra and Kordin, but also courtesy of the University of Malta, Tassilj, and courtesy of the Superintendents of Cultural Heritage, some from Tarshin and some from Kerchem. Those results I don't have yet, so I'll be focusing mostly on Hajar Ibn Naidra and Kordin. The samples all belonged to two main fabrics technological groups, though all using the same base clay, which is hardly a surprise, and each group has subgroups. And all the groups were found at all of the sites investigated, though in slightly differing proportions. And this is the thing, when you look macroscopically, just with your eyes or a regular magnifying glass, you may start to see differences in fabric, but those differences are what we're seeing rather than the definition of fabric in chemical, geological, and mineralogical terms, right? Oh, ran ahead. Right, let's look at the main fabric groups. The first one, which we're calling fabric 1A, is shell-tempered fabric. Now, with clay, clay includes things in it, right? It's never just pure clay. They are inclusions. And then you can add stuff to clay to change its properties. Now, sometimes it's very hard to distinguish between what's a natural inclusion and what's a temper, what's been added. In this case, we know something is added because you see it in certain quantities, right? That's one way. I mean, it's not straightforward, but go with me with this for now. Fabric 1A is very coarse and it has loads and loads of shell in it, bits of shell which we think may be some kind of bivalve, but this is my appeal to you, my second appeal, is we really need an expert in shells to help us determine the type of shell present, if it's possible to do it from this. So if you or anyone you know is an expert in shells, would you please get in touch, because we really need to have a long conversation about this. The other thing we'll find, and I'll get into more detail in this in the next slide, are what we call, I'm going to say grog in inverted commas. Let's go with clay pellets. These are rarely found in this fabric. Then fabric 1B has shell and glauconite temper. It's relatively rare. Glauconite is another type of mineral. I have 10 million questions I'm investigating about glauconite because it has a certain origin. I don't have those answers just yet, but I'm pursuing the questions. And it's all right. Listen, I'm always straightforward about these things. The process of inquiry, of finding things out, it takes many directions. Right, fabric 2B is chalk temp. And you can see the chalk mark there. It doesn't occur that often in terms of numbers, but it's found at most sites. Again, I will have more precise numbers later this year. It's quite closely related and often contains these clay pellets, but it's dominated by chalk rather than grog. Oh, have I mixed fabric too? I'm so sorry. Let me go back one. Fabric 2 runs the spectrum from being fine to somewhat coarse. Now, when we say coarse, and we're talking about petrography, we mean coarse in a geological sense. There are numbers and that you have to follow of what proportion of something has to be present for something to be coarse. And we have these clay pellets, which some people call grog, but really they're clay pellets that might be pieces of crushed ceramic, or lightly fired clay. Now, when I say crushed ceramic, don't go down the route of Defoon. You know, the Maltese practice of crushing pots, adding it to things, and it makes the most wonderful waterproofing. It's not that, because if it were that, the voids that you see on the slide would look very different. Because if it were already fired pottery, when you fire it again, it would contract much more and leave a different kind of void. So that's why we think there are these clay pellets that might be lightly fired or dried and then added as a temper. And then that's the reason of these voids. But I need to look at more voids, basically. I know, my life is full of glam. Right. Implications, let's wind up. Implications of all this. The production of ceramics is more complex and fluid than old typologies imply. There's a wide range of tools, techniques, and intersite differences. We have a wide range of tools and motor actions in the MJAR phase, so hopefully this tells us something else about a phase that's normally overlooked. But also, my point here is that decoration is not just a surface treatment, it's part of the manufacturing process. If we go back to the biography of a pot, late Neolithic communities are not just about temples and rituals, important as those are. And journeys are not just important in terms of cosmology, you know, the going between places of life, places of death, following the contours, going from above ground to below ground. That's really important, but it's not the only kind of journey. Because what we're seeing when we look at these tools, these motor actions, and all these things, is we are seeing communities of practice and learning. We're seeing how knowledge is transmitted, and the knowledge that existed in the temple period, especially in the late Neolithic, was not just ritual or cosmological knowledge, but that's these really important knowledge on making things. And I'm sure there's the same with things like stone tools, that they just need to be investigated. I'm sure they are being. So motor actions show histories of learning. Mostly we have uniform levels of skill, but we also have the B for effort, sort of, my perhaps some long lost ancestor. But these things also show community bonds, relationships when learning, and they remind us that communities are not timeless. And when knowledge is being transmitted, that means that your community is very dynamic. So stop focusing on just stones and just realize that we have really interesting people here. So I plan to continue on the petrographic analysis. I want to investigate the correlation between tools, motor actions, and fabrics. Lots to be done there. So that's my next few fun months. And I want to determine statistically the proportion and occurrence of each fabric and see if there's any significant difference between sites and what that difference looks like. So I just want to end by thanking Heritage Malta with special love to the Museum of Archaeology and Prehistoric Sites staff, past and present, because they've been on this journey with me. The superintendents, especially Kevin, the University of Malta, Nick and John, of course, Joe Magroconti, Daniel Cilia, without whom we wouldn't have Maltese prehistory in the present. And the petrography is funded but very generously by a British Academy grant. And as Daniel reminds us, stop destroying the environment. The heritage we have is precious, not just because it looks great, not just because we have some of the most complex materializations of belief systems I've seen anywhere in the world, but because of this, the people, okay? We're looking at people. Let's not kill more people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.